this event in collaboration with Sweden, the Centre for Climate Care and the Scottish Polar Research Institute. Polarised debate, is there a middle ground on geoengineering? It's a very important time to be discussing this question, with 2024 being the first year to surpass that 1.5 degree threshold, and with around £60 million of government funding into into research into climate cooling approaches. The debate is hotting up, I suppose, and it's important to discuss whether a middle ground can be found between a debate that's often quite polarized. So we have two fantastic speakers, Professor Martin Floria, Professor of Physical Geography, specializing in polar environments, and Albert van Wijngaarden, PhD researcher on polar geoengineering governance. So I'll pass over to Albert first.
Thanks. Great. Hi, everyone. Great to see so many of you there. I think both from engineering and a lot of geographers in SPRI. Fantastic to be here. So my title is a little bit of a ploy on what Colm just introduced with a question mark. So I'm trying to be a bit maybe provocative, or at least stir some thoughts, not leaving from the observation that there is a polarized debate, but questioning what that means. So I'm a polar scientist, and when I introduce myself as such, very often people raise their eyebrows and I have to explain again. Some think I study the country of Poland, but very few think about polarization. But I'm speaking here about polarization, and that's because in 2024 we published, together with colleagues, we published this piece in the Conversation that was in part about polarization. So it's 2024 that this was published, and some of the things that Colm mentioned happened afterwards. So I will come back to this point during my talk. Just to situate myself, we're in geography after all, so positionality is important. I'm also part of the conversation which I aspire to analyze. So apart from being a PhD student here studying geoengineering, I'm also involved in a project funded by Area and Community Engagement around climate cooling technologies. And I'm involved in an assessment by the University of the Arctic, which you can also find in your browser if you type in cool.earth. Can speak more about that later. But just as a little bit of background, because we've been speaking about geoengineering, what does geoengineering really mean? And there are various definitions and also various alternative terms that are being used. But for pragmatism's sake, we probably should keep it somewhere around large-scale interventions in the climate system. Sometimes people add with an intent to mitigate the effects of climate change. Here you see the most discussed current proposals, which are solar radiation management, which try to block some incoming solar radiation and thereby cool temperatures at Earth's surface. We can go into this more, but I would also highlight that there are more interventions than these, specifically in the polar regions. As a polar researcher, I also look at this is an illustration of how this looks like in the polar regions of stratospheric aerosol injection. We also have more targeted ideas to drill down into ice sheets or build some kind of barriers that would block some warm water in front of marine terminating glaciers. Because Mark is speaking afterwards, I couldn't resist including the mammoth, which has been proposed as a way to mitigate the effects of permafrost thaw. And as Colm already introduced, there is a tendency to see this field as highly polarized. When I first wrote that article, I started to talk with, this was kind of hot off the press, or was going around, an international non-use agreement call, which Mike Hume, a professor of the university here, he was the editor of the journal where this was published, so there's also some links there. And this was a kind of a collaboration between various scientists, which has been signed many, many times since then, to advocate for a non-use agreement on solar geoengineering. A response came back to this, a call for balance. So here you see two sides where, on the one hand, there were researchers who advocated, I wouldn't say against research, but were cautious of research. And on the other hand, there were researchers who said, no, this is the wrong approach. I'm not going to go into that now, but this is where this idea of a polarization very sharply emerged. More recently, in the polar region context, there was this paper that got a lot of traction, Safeguarding the Polar Regions from Dangerous Geoengineering. In the same publication, there was also a comment which Mark also co-authored, which tried to argue against this. So again, you have this dynamic of two opposing visions. And this paper also got a lot of traction. So this were some newspaper headlines. So really, if you focus on these two examples, you get a bit of a sense of the conversation is between those who say yes and no. And I can give several more examples. Maybe one revealing one is around the cessation of a geoengineering project, or a project that is labeled as geoengineering. I study this project for my PhD. It's called the Arctic Ice Project. When it stopped its operations, there were those on the one hand who said, oh, this is a great event, and this shows that geoengineering is a bad thing, and it's a step into the right direction. Well, on the other side, there were people who said, oh, it's also a good thing that they stopped, but it shows that we're responsible in the geoengineering field, and that geoengineering research can be done in a responsible way. So again, this polarized debate frame keeps popping up, or you can see it in many places. But perhaps I would argue that we can look at this a little bit more clearly, perhaps first starting with the question, what is exactly polarized? Because the title of this presentation is a polarized debate. Well, in a way, a debate is always polarized. You have two sides of a conversation which try to convince each other. But is this really a polarized conversation about geoengineering research? Or are we thinking perhaps about climate? Or is it about polar geoengineering research? Is this a polarized conversation about the position of geoengineering within broader conversations about climate action? Or is this in general a feature of a more larger scale conversation about the role of technology, capital, the polluter pays, so justice arguments in climate action in general? One thing that I've found striking, so I've also been guilty of speaking about polarization. However, there hasn't been a single scientific study that proves, or there hasn't been a quantification of how polarized researchers are. So you hear it a lot, but it's mainly anecdotal. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. But it might also indicate that we can give other diagnoses. For example, sticking to the polar frame, that there is a multipolarity converging, at least. This can be seen in several different ways, that different voices are now getting involved in the geoengineering conversation. Some people who hadn't been involved before because research funding became available, or what you see perhaps happening in the tipping point community, that some researchers start to engage with this. You can also see it within the polls that polarity assumes. So for example, within the pro-research poll, there's recently the news of Stardust, a for-profit company, really made a lot of impact, I think, and we can go into that later. But those who were assumed to be in the past most on the pro-research side, if this is an example of a comment by David Heath and Daniel Vizioni, two very prominent researchers in the field, who now say, yes, we're in favor of research, but not this kind of research. Maybe an example of the multipolarity that is emerging. You can also point to more, we can label them as conspiracy theory, or in any case, people who see this topic differently. Because we've been speaking about this as a climate change tool. For other people, this is a very different kind of conversation. And this is not just in the US that this takes place. It was also here in the UK. There's also a petition against geoengineering. And I attended the debate in Parliament. And for many of the spectators, the conversation that emerged was a wrong one, because they wanted to speak about the deep state, about chemtrails and health, and the conversation instead was about climate change. Another diagnosis that we might see or give would be a growing monopolarity within geoengineering conversations. So research is really advancing rapidly, and this is an example of a few weeks ago that did its rounds in the geoengineering community, where Heidi Silvestre, who is perceived to be on the really anti-side of the conversation, very skeptical towards geoengineering. It's big enough. This is the most important part, I would say. So in this post, she says, genuinely respect Arctic reflections and realize to geoengineering companies for doing rigorous science instead of rushing to deployment. I used to be 100% against geoengineering research, but the field is moving so quickly that I've had to evolve. So she goes on into that. So perhaps we can say, instead of the polarized debate that there is, we see increasingly monopolarity, where everybody kind of agrees that research is done or maybe should be done and should be done in the right way. And then you have some outline views. I'm not saying that any of these are right. You can give many different diagnoses. And the background, of course, apart from examples like Stardust, is that research is advancing, and partially by private funding, but also by public funding. So that as a bit of background context. And then I would like to add, a little bit, 1 minute over already, but this is my last slide, with the question if polarization, if it is said to be there, if that is really bad. From my conversations with people who are skeptical towards geoengineering, polarization, as I interpret them, is a perfect political strategy. The pro-geoengineering camp, in their opinion, has been getting a lot of attention, a lot of funding. There are a lot of paid positions for geoengineering researchers, and not so many for those who are against it. So it's a bit of a David against Goliath frame, and in that, polarization can be a very effective strategy. Moreover, to highlight some of the risks that perhaps don't sound so sexy in public media, but deserve to be discussed more. One of the arguments, for example, that the anti-camp has been foregrounded for a very long time is the difficulty of governing these kind of technologies. And in a world of Donald Trump and international rules-based order collapsing more and more every single day, that is an objection that perhaps deserves more attention. So I think to the kind of the bottom line argument that we made before is that even if research is advancing, it might be tempting to thereby say, okay, to stick to us who agree with what we're doing and stick to our own belief as researchers. I think that the voices of those who critique these kind of technologies should be heard and should be heard strongly. That thereby polarization perhaps is not necessarily the bad thing that it's made out of. Then, for lack of time, I will rush through these a little bit. But maybe also polarization can be seen as a natural feature of these technologies. Geoengineering is not a normal scientific research field. It's been labeled as an emerging disruptive technology or controversial technology. And perhaps this belongs to it. Sean, we published a paper recently also to look at controversies in medical science, like embryo research. That's also a highly controversial field where some degree of polarization is normal, similarly in climate debates. And then finally, I would end by saying that if we're looking for a middle ground, well, perhaps this is an example of how in many different places the middle ground is found. Where you're in the geography department with engineers, geographers, having a conversation. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, Albert. In a way, when listening to you, I felt like those debates on AI, which basically occur in a fast-moving field, so that the moment you had an opinion, it's outdated. So in a way, the middle ground might actually be in this sort of, or partly in realizing that what you think about something that's moving very fast at one point might actually be very different in a month's time. Yeah, I just wanted to give a few slides on several aspects. We had a little chat with Albert yesterday to ensure that at least we would not overlap and basically have very similar slides in our short interventions. But the first one, and that was actually triggered by a question from Clara about when did you start doing research in geoengineering and how did you get here, in a way? That got me thinking. I have two slides on that, actually. The first one is an introduction of who I am. Those in the geography camp, especially in the SPRI camp, already more or less know what I do and who I am, but this is a wider audience. So just a very short introduction to why I am in any way part of this debate. I am a professor in physical geography, and at the core of my research is studying environmental change in the terrestrial part of the Arctic. And this includes or involves changes in land cover, vegetation responses to warmer Arctic temperatures, and also how biological interactions and also abiotic interactions moderate or modulate these responses. In particular, the role of very large herbivores in the Arctic as ways or as agents that are able to modify land cover. And once you basically establish that, how is that modified land cover playing in the air system and the overall radiative budget of the Arctic? So this is what we do. We are quite focused on, for lack of a shorter expression, Arctic rewilding, that is reintroducing or introducing a guild of large animals in the Arctic as a climate mitigation intervention. So in a nutshell, large animals trample and browse and graze in the Arctic in search for food, mostly. And in doing so, they are big agents in preventing the encroachment of large vegetation, large-bodied vegetation, tall shrubs, and other plants in the tundra. And that has clear effects on the insulation of the underlying permafrost with the atmospheric temperatures above. In other words, it increases the coupling between these two components of the air system. And in doing so, they prevent permafrost warming, or at least mitigate it. And they also play a huge role in the albedo. So that's basically the link between, Arctic biotic interactions and seeing large-scale ecological engineering initiative as a means to modify some key properties of the air system in a place or in a region that's warming, as you know, extremely fast. So if we consider large-scale ecosystem engineering as a nature-based climate solution, we are very, very close to considering a climate intervention, and hence we are in the same sort of area or conceptual domain than many other geoengineering proposals that aim at doing the very same thing. However, our field is relatively tangential, especially to the most polarized debates on geoengineering. So I've come into this debate from a position of not actually being attacked by this, but by seeing the development of the debate concerning very different geoengineering intervention proposals, and actually being tempted, and I can see that in my field, as not really labeling what we do as geoengineering, because it basically carries a baggage that might actually feel unnecessary, because we can escape it in a way by just talking about it from a different point of view. At the same time, we are not free from debates that potentially become polarized, and those are linked with rewilding and the management of nature to basically modify the properties of the air system. So in a way, there are many parallelisms between these two areas. And in here, that would be potentially an interesting sort of avenue to think about how is that debate evolving, how has it started, and what are the camps in which it has, if not split, organized, so that we can actually try to have a higher tier view on both and find commonalities. But thinking a bit more about what was my first sort of real point of contact with geoengineering debates, I remember a discussion I had over 10 years ago in Oxford with a fellow colleague at the School of Geography and the Environment there. I used to work there, where in a coffee break, we just started talking about, climate change, environmental crisis, so on. At one point, we started realizing that we were relatively, not in agreement over fundamental questions. And at one point, I had this question to say, hey, if you could have a dial and you could actually reduce the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere to 350 parts per million tomorrow, could you do it? And she said, no, I would never do that, because that's not the root cause of the problem. I said, well, it is the root cause of the problem. The root cause of climate change is anthropogenic concentrations, anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations. And she said, no, the root problem is much deeper. It's the organization of the global society and the global industrialized capitalism. And climate change is just one aspect of it. So if you ask me what needs to change, it has to be much deeper than the concentration of greenhouse gases. So that made me think about, sometimes when we are talking about this, we really come from very, very different points of view. We could have, excuse my simplification to the engineers in the room, we could have climate change as an engineering problem, which would basically tackle the radiative budget of the air system and say, okay, we have a problem, it's climate change. It's to do with an imbalanced radiative budget. How do we sort that? But we can also see climate change as a much wider problem to do with the global economic system, industrialized capitalism, in which climate change is one aspect of many other things that are basically following from a system that's seen as unfair and sustainable with no future, that's bringing us to situations of stress. So in a way, depending on where you come from, you can have a very different attitude towards, for example, a geoengineering idea, which tackles one component of the air system. In here, as Albert also tried, I tried to be a bit provocative here, but I've also seen this sort of a climate change as a deserved punishment for our acts. We are here because of our own making, and we cannot deny that. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we now must suffer the consequences no matter what, because we made it happen, right? The repent attitude, I would say. And it's not that there are people who only think that way, but it is an element that I identify in debates about climate change. If we follow that, and we actually probably polarizing more rather than trying to find a middle ground, optimism could be seen as a foolish utopianism, if that word exists. I didn't check it, or even cynicism. I just want business as usual. I'm very comfortable with my life. Let's imagine that there is a solution beyond, sacrifice in a way. And this frivolity is also something that many times you find in this type of debate. Before I get into the debate itself, I just wanted to give you at least my journey to my present attitude towards either climate solutions to do with nature-based interventions or geoengineering in general. But we start with the COP21 agreement, and I think this is kind of a big battle horse in this debate. We did agree globally in a legally binding international treaty, you can find its details in the UN web pages, to basically combat climate change and aim to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, preferably 1.5. This happened in Paris. I was looking for pictures of Paris, but I thought that given the current debate, it might be that Disneyland Paris might be a good picture to illustrate that event. So it entered in force in 2016. Nearly all nations are compelled to submit these national determined contributions. So in a way, we live in a world where the United Nations agreed on objectives that have a very clear goal, which is limit global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees above industrial temperatures. Why did we agree to that? Albert was mentioning tipping points. This is a paper from 2022, which basically just shows the likelihood of key components in the Earth systems to basically shift into a different state in different scenarios, right? And this comes from paleoclimatic data and from climate modeling data. And in the plot here, you can see basically a global warming relative to pre-industrial, and then in the y-axis for the upper plot, what you see is the different components. And if we focus on the ones that might actually start shifting into in our lifetimes and in our civilizational times, irreversible new states, we have plenty of polar ones, but between 1 and 2 degrees warming, we have the destabilization of the Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, things to do with the thermohighland circulation, as well as sea ice and permafrost in the polar region. So it's a very polar, pertinent, let's say, set of reasons why the Paris Agreement ended up with this goal. So that's fine. How are we doing? And this is, to me, this is, as we can debate about that, and obviously it's not really the only source of data, but this is a paper by James Hansen, who you might know because of research in climate change that dates back from the late 70s. James Hansen basically has this plot that I think is very revealing. Essentially, these are our contributions to anthropogenic global warming, divided into different forcings, from CO2 to methane to other gases such as those banned during the Montreal Protocol or minor greenhouse gases. And essentially, we get into the present with a given forcing on the y-axis. That is on a given push towards an imbalance in the radiative budget of the Earth. And we end up with a gap with respect to our goals for a safe future. That is a gap that exists and cannot be met with our current trajectories of decarbonization, right? And that doesn't mean that decarbonization is not working. It's obviously essential and very much needed. But when we count about it, if we take 2 + 2, meaning we have agreed on this, and this is what we are doing so far, we have a gap, and that gap needs to be filled somehow. That doesn't mean that suddenly all geoengineering becomes a good idea. Most will probably be not a good idea, but the need to find a way to basically bridge that gap seems to me obvious, and that's basically why I get into this. What worries me the most about this, and I am not a proponent of geoengineering, after all I said, I'm a proponent of doing research on geoengineering, because if we believe in the evidence that I just showed you, we are in a relatively tight or absolutely tight situation where we need to basically consider other options alongside decarbonization. But as Albert said, the debate is not only on geoengineering, yes or no, but the debate has been on whether we should conduct research on geoengineering. And in this aspect, I am very, very much on one end of the spectrum, whereas, which is basically, yes, we should conduct research on geoengineering. I can have many arguments why this is important. And one of the main reasons for this sort of a debate is to do with whether you're attitude towards geoengineering labels you as a risk taker versus a more paused and thoughtful citizen. Another kind of big engine for this debate is the picturing climate interventions and decarbonizations are mutually exclusive. And I think that that would be a great advancement if we all agree that they are not mutually exclusive, and that one doesn't damage the other. On the contrary, they are needed. Probably many people here will agree, others might not, but we are already geoengineering. And it's kind of an easy argument to say, oh, this has always happened, since the early Holocene when humans started altering the Earth's surface. We have been affecting the Earth system and so on. But I would argue, the real geoengineering comes when we become aware that we are modifying the Earth system. And that's probably 4 decades ago, 5 decades ago, to a global degree, so that we are really, really affecting the Earth system in a manner that we know changes fundamental properties of it, and we know about it, and we keep on doing what we do. The moment we do that, I would argue, we are geoengineering. So being very afraid of geoengineering is a legitimate approach, but that brings me to the fact that the debate is not about no geoengineering versus a world that has no issues, but it is a debate about having a proper counterfactual. So the debate is not about geoengineering, yes, and then geoengineering, no, and a safe world, but it's about what are the risks of geoengineering versus the risk of not doing or not considering anything to do with extra options in geoengineering. So if we really need to basically assess the potential feasibility of these options, including research on these options, we need to first be very aware of the current trajectory in which we are, and not even compare potential interventions to the present, but to the future without those interventions, right? And that is fundamental, and I think it's relatively obvious, but it's not really something that emerges in all debates. So in a way, what I would argue is that if we have to basically start debating these openly, we need to debate not only the consequences of potential options, but also the consequences of not doing anything else than keeping with our current pathways. So there is moral hazards in a way in both camps, and we need to basically be honest to basically embrace them and ensure that whatever we decide to eventually in the long run or in the short run implement or deploy has taken into account both aspects. I will finish with this. And actually, this is an interesting thought in a way, very geographical at the same time. But when I was involved in this discussion that Albert mentioned, this is my last slide, by the way, I'm done. I realized that there were no Arctic inhabitants in that debate. Let's ban polar geoengineering. Oh no, let's not ban polar geoengineering research. It's needed, etc. But at the end of the day, the Arctic is not a global commons. The Antarctic, we could argue that it might be, but not the Arctic. So Arctic peoples must be central to these decisions. Knowledge co-production is essential. And surprisingly, in a way, there is not that much research about attitudes of indigenous and local inhabitants of, for example, the Arctic towards geoengineering. The research that exists shows quite a plurality of views and many positive views about it, in part very much linked to the fact that the effects of climate change in the Arctic are so huge that the option of looking for more solutions is not seen as immediately a bad actor sort of idea. So I will finish with that and open to keep on discussing with all of you. Thank you.
Thanks so much to you both. We'll now move into about a few minutes of moderated discussion led by Clara Bosso, pursuing her PhD on participatory governance and climate interventions. So I'll hand it over to you.
Do I need a microphone? Hi everyone, and thank you so much, Mark and Albert. I guess the way I see your presentations and also knowing you, and Mark also said that you do sit on a very extreme of this debate when it comes to research, that you do think we need research, and I guess Albert is doing research in the field somehow, studying the research. That is a form of research too. So I would put you on that side of the spectrum. Then I wonder, considering the state of the climate, which we're all aware of, and the fact that we do need to consider multiple opinions if we want to foster democracy and participation, how do you see us promoting a productive or constructive debate with people who are on multiple spots in this spectrum, while acknowledging that we are running out of time if we're not to cross critical tipping points?
You can start.
Yeah, the last bit is a qualifier, I would say, because if you start with the assumption of we need to do this urgently, we need to do this now, that would really probably scare some people away who are a bit less eager to speak about this. I think patience is something that is needed in this, and that's also from, so both with the area project, but also through the UArctic project that I mentioned before. I engage sometimes with indigenous representatives, and from them it's also a very clear message that I get across. You need to be patient. We are feeling the effects of this, but we're not going to greenlight your new technology now because we've suffered under colonialism for centuries and we don't trust you at this moment, and your technology is highly uncertain. So I would say, yes, there is urgency, but at the same time, there needs to be patience. And that can be a paradox. There's a paper by indigenous scholar Carl White, where he takes a very provocative stance. It's not specifically around geoengineering, but he argues that maybe it's too late to both repair our relations with indigenous peoples who have been hurt and repair the damages of climate change that in London's paper in 2020 can look that up. So that's a bit of a caveat, I would say, around the urgency. Otherwise, I think it's moving forward. Like I said, this kind of a meeting that I see that it's something very, very positive, and there are several other people who are now getting involved, and there are platforms that are offered that aren't perceived to be either very pro or very anti, that are now also spaces of conversation. Many international organizations are trying to make sense of this now. It's not to say that we're already there, but these conversations are starting.
We have one. Yeah, not much so. I agree with Albert. I would probably point to two things. One is that our fight against polarization comes at a difficult time in the sense that as societies, we tend to get polarized very easily over nearly everything these days. So in a way, the time is poor in the overall tendency that we are showing as societies basically tackling each other. So that needs an extra effort because you could see in Albert's presentation, the real causes behind trying to ban certain geoengineering techniques are to do with chemtrails and with unrelated actual reasons for what geoengineering option A would be proposed. And that sort of a general sort of mapping of debates transcends the debate of geoengineering, but it affects it as well. The other one is this discussion on the urgency as a tool, as a technique to basically force your way. I fully sympathize with that, not because I sympathize with it fundamentally, but because there is myriad examples where this sort of reasoning has been used basically for societies into a variety of actions. In a way, it's a way to take power, right? And potentially suppress nuances and potentially visions that might emerge if there is no urgency. And I agree with Albert that it's quite paradoxical and difficult to negotiate. What I would argue as well is that to a degree, we have to decide whether the evidence that has been mounting over the last over a century on the current trajectory of the climate system and our intervention in it is really something that we truly take seriously, take it home, and in which case I argue we are in an emergency situation. So there is this sort of two realities. One is the fact that urgency can be used as a tool to force it away, and the other is that we might actually be in an urgent situation. So what do you do when you have when a tractor crosses the road? You have to brake very fast, right? So there is this sort of tension between acknowledging that the argument of being in urgent time might be used to basically force it away, and the fact that we are probably living in an urgent time and we probably need to act fast on certain aspects. And I don't have an answer to that, but I go and mix them in a way. Because the moment you say we are in an urgent time, you can be told, oh, no, you cannot say that because you're trying to force it away. But you think, well, what if we are in an urgent time? What do we need to do in order to kind of keep this dialogue, being aware that it can be used as a tool as well as a pressure tool?
So one more thing to add, which I really agree with you saying, Mark. And one of the things that might make it more difficult if this urgency is felt more strongly is that this doesn't simply revolve around mitigation of climate change, but can be a security topic. So Iceland has already declared AMOC collapse as a potential national security threat, which brings it into a very different register, and then maybe higher risk taking is something that people accept. So yeah, maybe that's not conducive to a proper and supportive conversation, but that might be one of the futures.
I guess in your presentation, Albert, you asked a very important question of what are we talking about when it comes to polarization, and I guess Mark answered, at least in your view, that we are polarized, mostly about research now. But then how do you link that to research? I guess in this field, people talk a lot about the slippery slope of conducting research and that immediately leading into deployment, and Albert mentioned for-profit companies that are in this field. Do you, considering that those actors are in the field, do you still think that we're only polarized when it comes to research?
Should I start this time? Yeah, I think, well, first of all, in some aspects, and I'm not coming from my long experience with other sectors, but it is clear that in environmental sciences and climate sciences, we are in a situation where many researchers have never actually done research that is immediately of interest to for-profit organizations, right? So the way that we negotiate our relationship with people and agents that I actually see that as a business opportunity, or even I was going to say worse, but even more as an opportunity to have leverage and power, we're very new at that. We haven't, as a field, we haven't actually had the experience of dealing with this sort of relationship. But in our universities, we have other departments which have dealt with the private industry and actors that are looking for profit for decades. We have chemistry, pharmacy, engineering, computer sciences. All these have very intricate relationships with the private sector and for-profit initiatives. We have to basically probably look at them and find ways of all this is negotiated, because it's not the first time in history that research ends up being of special interest for profit organizations. That's one thing. The other one is on the back of the Stardust development. We can ban research on geoengineering, but that research will keep on happening. And we are not going to have any voice on it. And in addition, whatever happens will be opaque and under copyrights or or patents, right? If we have a healthy geoengineering research environment, we're going to have transparent science that will be shared to the benefit of the wider society, even if that science ends up saying, well, that's a no-go, right? It's more difficult than a for-profit will end up saying that's a no-go, because the very objective of for-profit is going to be to make money out of that in case it works, right? So I would actually be even more proactive into having a leadership role in researching engineering and the public sector to basically make sure that that's where most of the debate happens. There was a last point that will come to me maybe while I was at talks, I'll remember it.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I will be a very boring academic and say what's complicated, what research is, where research sounds great and very nice, and it has these neutrality, objective kind of connotations in some ways. But geoengineering research can be that in relation to that. So some research, for example, on glaciers. There is now research of projects that I'm studying looking at the way that water is lubricating glaciers. And that's important also to know for climate change and maybe even on the local level how surging glaciers might move. So that's one of the kind of research I speak about. A lot of geoengineering research is also a bit of a hybrid of various things coming together, where engineering is a big component to this. There's a bit of startup culture in this as well, and that changes the connotations of research, at least for me, a little bit, because it's about, apart from finding out what there is and understanding something, it's also about designing something. And there are these arguments about that you lock in certain design features become more relevant. Think, for example, with the project at CCR on sea ice thickening. Real ice and Arctic reflection both pursue different strategy, and Real Ice is now exploring the possibility of unmanned underwater submarines, which maybe is a great thing, but if the eventual goal of research is delivering a technology that works, that policymakers can then use or not use, then having either a submarine or a thing above the ice that pumps water makes a big difference in how policymakers can proceed. So that's one example of the way that, not to say that lock-in is everything and that there's immediately a slippery slope, but research does change what you eventually deliver to policymakers. That's a model that you follow, and many geoengineering researchers claim at least to follow that model, that you develop something and then you offer it to somebody who either buys it off you or you give it.
Yeah, I would say that with geoengineering research in particular, there is no, if we come from that club where we have a gap in the radiation budget, we need to basically bridge that gap somehow. It is a type of research that looks for a solution, right? So it has a goal, and the goal is that something will work and will be able to be deployed. So by definition, there has to be a slippery slope in the sense that something should actually end up being deployed, right? That's the engine behind thinking about geoengineering options. It's not let's trash this option. It's let's study whether it could actually work, right? So in this aspect, yes, there is obviously a goal that at least some of these technologies, if not perhaps one or perhaps multiple, might actually have a utility. We might find through research that the utility of that technology is not its initial goal, but it can have localized benefits, or it can lead to other developments tangential to the original goal. That would be a win-win already. The more we engage with it, the more we can lead the conversation about how to regulate this slope, whether it is slippery or sticky, right? And the more we can have a view on which are the checkpoints that we agree collectively about that, that might actually kill a potential option, because we have reached the point of no return where actually, this doesn't make any sense. It doesn't scale up, it's too expensive, it's unfeasible, it's unrealizable, it cannot work. We're not there. I would argue with really any option in geoengineering. So again, I go back to the fact that the more openly we embrace research in geoengineering, the more we can actually lead that dialogue, and the more we can control the degree of friction of that flow. But we have to acknowledge, and it would be naive or even cynical to say, no, there is no objective in geoengineering in terms of deploying. Let's separate deployment from research. The reality is that if you are doing all that, it's because you're hoping that some of these things will have a future in the real world, right? And that, in a way, is also part of this debate in the sense that you can argue against somebody who's fundamentally against engineering for ethical, moral, governance, social justice. There are many reasons, even scalability issues. But we should, the proponents of the research in engineering should be honest enough to say, yes, you're right. We are hoping that some of these options will actually work, right? It cannot be that we just want to analyze and we don't care about, down the road whether there is zero that will work. That will be fine. Well, it will be fine because when we conclude that, that will mean that they were bad ideas. But it will not be fine from the point of view that we're looking for adding solutions that we didn't find. But the more we engage with it, the more we can actually lead that discussion and bring it to our agreed sort of set of criteria.
Well, in the interest of time and to foster dialogue, I would save my questions and open the floor if anyone wants to ask something. Should we pass the mic or?
Yeah, I just wanted to elaborate more on the point you said about Iceland, because they are the inhabitants of the Arctic, and they're very worried about the Arctic collapse. And some of the influential EU politicians and some of the influential politicians describe the EU moratorium as, I quote here, effectively strips small, high-risk nations of their right to explore survival strategies. Do you think this moratorium is an attack on their sovereign right to protect themselves?
Yeah, it's an interesting question that I think brings many different sub-questions together. Maybe I would sideline if it's an attack on the sovereignty. One of the arguments, of course, for allowing research is academic freedom of research, and that researchers should be allowed to do research. But there are plenty of examples, cloning, chemical weapons, where technologies have been found too dangerous or controversial that globally people have abandoned. Now, I'm not saying that geoengineering falls into the same category, but there have been examples where similar things have happened. Specifically on the case of Iceland, it's very understandable, and AMOC is, of course, as it is in the UK, AMOC collapse is a huge risk. One of the problems that some researchers have with framing that all around SAI, that it makes SAI the only possible option to get out there, which it might very well be, but SAI will also have massive so business transfer curves from injection, a lot of other impacts. It's basically a global technology. So
yeah, well, absolutely. Current strategy is to actually current strategy will be immediately to concentrate and put better regions so that have high latitude areas. So
yeah, the modeling studies show that there is a significant effect globally, even if you do it in polar regions. So you will have to engage with the entire world. It's a bit of a cliche, but what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. It's the same with this, especially because it's
say that without the evidence, but yeah, I think initially it would be a polar focus strategy.
I don't have a question, I just want to make it more a little way. What I want to ask you, you say that the Arctic isn't a global commons, right? So if you think about it in terms of this, and somebody who lives in northern Norway, for example, right, might be several hundred kilometres or maybe 1,000 kilometres from the centre of the Arctic Ocean, which is undeniably in the Arctic. And I'm only like 60 miles, 100 miles from the International Space Station when it's going over my house. And I wouldn't argue that I kind of own the orbit of the International Space Station. So why would somebody who lives even in northern Norway or in Siberia or in northern Canada, why would they have any more say in what happens over the Arctic Ocean than I would have, let's say, what happens in the Azores or just in Dakota? It doesn't seem to make any sense to me. We have this idea of ownership. It's so extended that it includes stuff that most people reason is we would be the global commons.
Well, I could turn around the question and say, why don't we get rid of all agricultural land in England and just put solar panels? Because it's going to solve the situation for Western Europe. So to see the argument, you know, the solar installation of England in particular. But you know, what I mean with that is we all depend on the Arctic system to a certain degree, right? Because it's, remember, it's that line that's definitely changes in the Arctic system affect us all. But then there are people whose daily livelihood depends on the Arctic because they live there. And not only that, but many of the problems that are at the moment experienced in the Arctic are not even making, right? So you can argue that you are going to be affected by changes in the Arctic living in Eastern England, and you will be right. But that's, in my view, many miles away from not having access to sustainable fishing, hunting, or very key environmental processes on which the lively subsistence of Arctic peoples depend on. And I'm not just talking about indigenous peoples with radio herds or traditional hunting grounds, but about industrialized Arctic inhabitants as well, which are fully dependent on Arctic environments in first degree, let's say. I do agree that this is a global discussion, and probably what I mean is that certain or all geoengineering options that are going to be deployed in the Arctic cannot actually happen if the Arctic peoples that would be directly affected do not agree. That doesn't mean that the non-Arctic players play no role in it, but it means that they play a different role, like you need to, right? Not proposing a governance system for that, but that's where I'm coming from. It's not that our voices from mid-latitudes do not count, but we don't have the last word on, for example, providing the Arctic, which would be something I'm doing research on.
All right, well, thank you so much to our brilliant speakers. Thank you so much for attending. We just have a couple notices. If you want to get involved more, so we have the new Climate Repair Society, which is meeting every Tuesday at 7 p.m. For the next 2 weeks. So do get involved with that. And we have a couple more events coming up this term. On the 12th of May, we have the Climate Repair Symposium. You'll hear about all of the research that the Centre for Climate Repair is doing. And then we also have on the 14th of May, Daniel Schrag, who is Professor Daniel Schrag from Harvard, Professor of Environmental Science and Engineering, who served on the Council of Advisors to President Obama for Science and Technology. We'll be speaking in the engineering building on 14th May at 1 p.m. So do get involved, scan the QR code. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you. Give a round of applause to our brilliant speakers.